At 78 years old, Benny Andersson has finally said out loud what fans have quietly believed for decades. For years, people watched ABBA's dazzling stage shows and matching outfits, and wondered if the joy was real or just a performance. Now, in a rare and honest moment, the quiet genius behind the piano has confirmed it. The perfect pop group the world fell in love with was never as perfect as it looked. Behind the platform boots and the flashing lights was a group of 4 young people who were scared, tired, and holding on to each other through music because they didn't know how else to survive fame. This is the story fans always suspected but never truly heard, told through the eyes of the man who wrote the songs. Long before the world knew his name, Benny Andersson was a boy from Västerås, Sweden, who fell in love with sound before he ever thought about fame. He grew up with an accordion in his hands, learning old folk tunes from his grandfather. That instrument, simple and unglamorous, taught him something that would shape his entire career. Music was not about showing off. It was about feeling something so deeply that you had to let it out. While other teenagers were listening to rock and roll on the radio, Benny was studying the way a chord could carry sadness even inside a happy melody. That skill, learned quietly in a small Swedish town, became the secret ingredient behind some of the biggest pop songs the world has ever heard. Those early years shaped him in ways he wouldn't fully understand until much later in life. Growing up in a working-class Swedish family, Benny didn't have access to formal music schools or expensive instruments. What he had was patience, curiosity, and an accordion that had belonged to someone else before him. He taught himself by ear, listening to the radio and copying what he heard until it sounded right. That kind of self-taught discipline built a stubbornness in him that never left. Even decades later, when he had access to the best studios and equipment in the world, Benny still worked the same way he did as a boy, trusting his own ear over anyone else's opinion, chasing a feeling rather than a formula. That quiet stubbornness would later become one of the most defining traits of his entire career. When Benny met Björn Ulvaeus, something clicked that neither of them fully understood at the time. Benny had the ear for melody and structure. Björn had a gift for words and stories. Together, they built a songwriting partnership that felt less like a business deal and more like 2 halves of the same brain. Benny would sit at the piano for hours, sometimes an entire day, chasing a single chord change until it felt right. He wasn't trying to write a hit. He was trying to capture a feeling he couldn't explain in words. That obsession with emotional honesty is why songs like Dancing Queen and The Winner Takes It All still make people cry decades later. Even though on the surface they sound like simple pop music, their partnership worked because it was built on a rare kind of trust. Björn has said in later years that he never doubted Benny's musical instincts, even when a melody seemed strange or unfinished at first. Benny, in turn, trusted Björn to find the words that matched the emotional shape of a song, even before a single lyric was written. This trust meant fewer arguments and more experimentation. They could try something risky, fail, and try again without anyone's ego getting bruised. It was a working relationship built on respect rather than competition, and that quiet harmony behind the scenes is part of why ABBA's catalog feels so consistent, even though it spans years of changing trends and personal turmoil. While Agnetha Faltskog and Annie Frid Lyngstad, known to the world as Frida, became the glamorous faces of ABBA, Benny often stood just outside the spotlight. He wasn't chasing attention. He didn't need to be seen singing into a microphone or wearing a sparkling jumpsuit. But over time, that choice came with a cost that few people talked about. Fans screamed for the 2 women on stage. Magazines put their faces on every cover. Meanwhile, the man who built the actual sound of ABBA, chord by chord, note by note, was often reduced to a name in small print. He wasn't jealous of his bandmates. He loved them. But being invisible while building something the whole world sang along to left a quiet ache that took years to admit. There is a reason ABBA's happiest songs still feel a little bit sad if you listen closely. That contrast, joy on the surface and something heavier underneath, was Benny's signature. He often took what could have been a simple happy tune and added a minor chord or a slower bridge that changed the whole emotional weight of the song. Without even realizing it, Listeners around the world were feeling something bittersweet every time they danced to an ABBA song. Benny once said that he never wanted a song to be just one emotion. Real life isn't just happy or just sad, and he believed music should reflect that truth. This is part of why ABBA's music has survived so many decades, while other pop acts from the same era have faded into the background. Benny also pushed the band into new sound territory long before it was trendy. While many pop groups in the 70s stuck to simple formulas, Benny experimented with early synthesizers, layered vocals, and studio techniques that were considered risky at the time. He wasn't satisfied with what was popular. He wanted ABBA's music to feel like a small movie playing inside your head, full of texture and emotion. This is part of the reason producers and musicians still study ABBA's studio recordings today. Benny wasn't just writing catchy tunes. He was quietly building the blueprint for modern pop production, years before most artists thought to try it. But behind the piano and the studio walls, Benny was also dealing with something far more personal. His relationship with Frida did not start with grand romantic gestures. It grew slowly, inside long recording sessions where the two of them shared something deeper than conversation. Music became the language they used when real words felt too difficult. Frida was warm, expressive, and open with her emotions. Benny was quiet, careful, and more comfortable expressing feelings through a melody than saying them out loud. Their differences made their creative work stronger, but they made their relationship complicated. What worked beautifully in the studio didn't always translate into a healthy connection once the recording light turned off. As their bond grew, so did the emotional weight neither of them fully understood at the time. Frida had experienced deep loss and instability early in her life, and she carried those wounds quietly. Benny, on the other hand, had learned from a young age to keep his emotions to himself, expressing them only through music. Neither of them had the tools to talk openly about pain, so instead they wrote about it. Songs became their form of therapy, a safe space where feelings could exist without needing to be spoken directly. It helped them create beautiful music together, but it also meant real conversations were often avoided instead of had. In many interviews over the years, Benny has hinted that he felt more emotionally open while sitting at a piano than he ever did in daily life. He could pour heartbreak, longing, and vulnerability into a song, but the moment the music stopped, so did his ability to talk about what he was really feeling. Frida needed someone who could be present with her outside of a recording booth, someone who could sit with difficult emotions rather than turn them into art. That mismatch slowly created distance between them, even as their professional partnership continued to produce some of the most emotional songs ABBA ever released. Songs like The Winner Takes It All were often assumed to be simple breakup ballads, dramatic but distant from real life. Over time, it's become clear that these songs carried much more personal weight than fans realized. Writing about pain gave Benny a sense of control that real conversations never could. Music let him process heartbreak on his own terms, safely, without needing to face anyone directly. Frida, however, lived inside those lyrics every time she sang them. For her, the songs weren't just performances. They were personal truths being sung out loud in front of millions of strangers, while the person who inspired them often stayed quietly behind the curtain. The public saw glamour, sold-out stadiums, and a fairy tale image of success, but inside the group, things were slowly falling apart in a way that had nothing to do with scandal. Benny wasn't the villain the headlines sometimes made him out to be. His struggle wasn't dishonesty or betrayal. It was emotional distance, an inability to fully show up outside of his music. He could write a melody that made an entire arena cry, yet struggle to have an honest conversation about his own feelings. That gap between artistic expression and emotional presence slowly became something too wide to repair, and it changed the course of both his personal life and the band's future. While fans spent years debating which woman in ABBA was more talented or more beautiful, the real quiet tension inside the group had very little to do with rivalry between Agnetha and Frida. It had everything to do with how the world saw Benny and Bjorn. Photographers wanted the women. Magazines wanted glamour shots and love stories. Meanwhile, the two men who built the actual sound of the band were often labeled simply as the songwriters working behind the scenes. For Benny, this wasn't really about needing more fame. It was about wanting people to understand the depth of what he was pouring into every song, something that couldn't be captured in a photograph. Benny has admitted that for years he was seen as the technical one, the quiet brain behind the operation, someone people assumed was more logical than emotional. That label never fit who he actually was. Every chord change, every pause, every layered harmony was Benny expressing something deeply personal, even if listeners never realized it. Critics often treated ABBA's music as catchy but shallow pop, easy to dance to, but not particularly meaningful. That misunderstanding quietly frustrated Benny for years, not because he wanted praise, but because he wanted people to see that real emotional work had gone into every single track. This mislabeling also shaped how Benny approached interviews and public appearances for years afterward. He grew cautious about explaining his creative process too deeply, worried that people would misunderstand or dismiss it the same way critics had dismissed the music itself. Instead, he let the songs speak for themselves, choosing silence over trying to convince the world of something he felt should have been obvious. Looking back, Benny has admitted this silence sometimes worked against him, allowing the narrative that he was simply the technical half of the group to stick around far longer than it should have. It's only now, decades later, that he feels comfortable enough to correct that record on his own terms. As ABBA's fame grew larger than any of them expected, so did the internal exhaustion. Touring across the world, recording new albums, and living under constant public attention slowly wore the group down. It wasn't one dramatic fight or a scandal that ended ABBA. It was something quieter and, in some ways, sadder. Benny has described reaching a point where the music no longer felt fully honest to him. The excitement that once made recording sessions feel electric had slowly faded into routine, and creating new material started to feel more like an obligation than genuine inspiration. By the time ABBA quietly stopped working together, Benny admits he wasn't staying out of passion anymore. He stayed out of a sense of duty, a feeling that he couldn't let the others down after everything they had built together. But deep down, the creative spark that once drove him had dimmed. There was no big meeting where the group officially announced their end. There was no dramatic farewell tour or emotional goodbye speech. ABBA simply faded into silence, the way many powerful things end, not with an explosion, but with a slow and quiet drift apart. Frida seemed to emotionally separate from the group before it officially ended, finding her own path forward with more ease than Benny did. For him, letting go took much longer. It reportedly took years before he truly processed that ABBA, the project that had defined most of his adult life, was over. The silence that followed wasn't just the absence of new music. It was the absence of identity, purpose, and the daily creative partnership that had shaped who he was for over a decade. That kind of ending doesn't come with headlines. It comes with quiet, private grief that takes a long time to fully understand. After ABBA's story quietly closed, Benny didn't disappear because he was running from fame. He stepped back to find peace after years of intense pressure. He turned toward new creative projects, composing music for theater productions like Chess and Christina Fran de Vemela. These projects gave him something ABBA's pop machine never fully allowed: space to explore complicated emotions without the noise of global fame surrounding every note. Working in theater became a kind of healing process, allowing Benny to reconnect with music simply for the sake of storytelling, rather than chart success or public image. During this period of reflection, Benny began to understand parts of his own emotional history that he hadn't fully processed while living through them. He has spoken about realizing, only with distance and age, how much unspoken emotion existed beneath ABBA's polished surface. Rather than avoiding those feelings, he slowly began to face them, using new music as a way to work through guilt, nostalgia, and unresolved emotional weight from his years in the group. This wasn't about rewriting history. It was about finally being honest with himself about what that chapter of his life truly meant. In more recent years, Benny has taken on a new role, mentoring younger composers and passing along decades of hard-earned wisdom. But his guidance goes beyond just musical technique. He often speaks about emotional honesty in songwriting, encouraging young artists to understand their own feelings before trying to express them through music. It's a lesson he wishes someone had taught him decades earlier. His journey from a reserved young musician hiding behind chords to a reflective mentor willing to talk openly about vulnerability shows a kind of growth that fame alone rarely produces. There's something quietly moving about watching a man who once avoided emotional conversations now spend his time teaching others how to have them. Those who have worked with Benny in recent years describe him as patient and generous, someone who listens more than he speaks, and who seems genuinely invested in helping younger musicians avoid the same isolation he once felt. He doesn't lecture about fame or success. Instead, he talks about honesty, about the importance of understanding your own emotions before putting them into a song. It's a strange kind of full-circle moment. The boy who once used music to hide is now teaching others how to use it to be seen. Now at 78, Benny Andersson has reached a point in his life where chasing approval no longer matters to him. What matters now is telling the truth about what ABBA really was. Not a flawless fairy tale, but four young people who found each other during a chaotic, overwhelming rise to fame and used music as their way of staying connected when everything else felt uncertain. ABBA's magic wasn't that they were perfect. It was that they were deeply human, flawed, uncertain, and often scared, yet still able to create something joyful enough to make the entire world dance. The truth Benny seems to be confirming now isn't a scandal or a dramatic secret. It's something quieter and, in many ways, more powerful. ABBA's music worked because the people behind it were struggling to hold themselves together, and the songs became the glue. The joy fans saw on stage was real, but it existed alongside real pain most people never noticed. Understanding that doesn't take away from ABBA's legacy. If anything, it makes their music mean even more, knowing that some of the most joyful pop songs in history were written by people who were quietly fighting to feel whole. As Benny looks back now, he's not trying to erase the past or protect an image anymore. He's simply choosing honesty over legend. For decades, fans sensed there was more beneath ABBA's glittering surface, and now, in his own words and reflections, Benny has confirmed exactly that. ABBA wasn't just a pop phenomenon built on catchy hooks and matching outfits. It was for people trying not to fall apart, using music as the one language that let them survive fame, heartbreak, and everything in between. And that honest, imperfect truth may be the most powerful part of their story yet.